And so it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Asli Berktay, who comes to us most immediately from the Texas A&M International University in Laredo, Texas. Dr. Berktay received her PhD in Latin American Studies, I believe, from Tulane University. And she has taught at several institutions, including Bosporus University, Sabancı University, and Bilgi University in Istanbul, as well as NYU Shanghai and the East China Normal University in Shanghai. She has conducted research in 9 countries and is fully fluent in 14 languages. And so with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Berktay.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you for anyone who is listening and who will be later on. I'm happy to be talking about an issue, a subject that is very important to me. I have been involved with the indigenous struggle in Brazil for about 20 years now. I chose to speak about 2 different contexts. One is the Ecuadorian context, the other one, the Brazilian. The Brazilian because I know it very well, and of course Brazil has the majority of the Amazon rainforest within its territory. Ecuador because it has always been an extremely interesting case of successful indigenous organizing, which I hope will come across clearly. I have prepared too many slides. I'm going to try to go through this as fast as I can. First, I will say that this photograph is by an indigenous photographer, Edgar Kaneko Chacriaba, who talks about his photography as a form of indigenous resistance in Brazil, which is the main reason why I really like to use his photos. So the term I want to start with some important terms, especially the ones that I have in the title for this talk. So obviously we have the idea of neoliberal encroachments, so encroachments as a movement into or inward, but especially the entry to another's property without right or permission, the idea of intruding or trespassing and violating the rights of others in the process. It's also very much connected to the concept of enclosure, because as you encroach into others' territory and rights, you're enclosing them similarly at the same time. So the historical process of enclosure refers to the expropriation whereby land and wealth owned in common is privatized, so very clearly related to neoliberalism, and formerly free persons are brought into disciplinary institutions. It can also refer to the gradual disappearance of freedoms, identity, rights, and personhood. So you can think of a rabbit-proof fence in Australia, an indigenous, a Native American reservation. You can very easily think of the decks of a slave ship. You can also think about anything related to the prison industrial complex, of course. So also with regards to neoliberalism, because it's just being thrown out so much nowadays, right? It's a term used to signify the late 20th century political reappearance of 19th century ideas that are associated with free market capitalism after its initial decline post-World War II. It is generally connected with the rise of conservative movements, I guess I needed a word there, of conservatism rather, and often implies policies of economic liberalization, privatization, deregulation, and so on. In Latin America, in the late 1980s and early 90s, many countries experimented with neoliberalism, and they were all governed by right-wing presidents who adopted the so-called Washington Consensus, which was a neoliberal formula coined by the World Bank and seen by enthusiasts as a quick way to financial glory. But not only did the system not work in any of these Latin American contexts that I'm mentioning here, it also produced disastrous results. But the way nobody usually learns from history, political elites in Latin America have started pursuing such and even stronger neoliberal policies over the last decade. And right now we have, I would say, numerous neoliberal governments and other governments that are reacting against such policies and tendencies. So the Amazon basin as a region, right, encompasses land belonging to 9 countries. The largest part of the rainforest, 58.4%, is contained within Brazil, and then 8 other countries, so Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, and Ecuador share the rest of it. And somehow, when I asked this question in my map quiz to my students 3 weeks ago, only 2 out of like 30 got it right. But what would be important to remember here is that Ecuador only has 1%, but Ecuador defines itself as an Amazonian country. So you definitely have some delusional national imaginings going on there. But the Ecuadorian presidents that I will be referring to are Rodrigo Borja Ceballos, Rafael Correa, and Guillermo Lasso. So with regards to the indigenous peoples in Ecuador, minority and indigenous groups include 14 distinct groups of people. Around 6.8% of the population of Ecuador currently self-identifies indigenous in the census. Yet many other estimates of the indigenous population are considerably higher. For example, CONAIE believes that indigenous peoples comprise somewhere between 25 and 30 of the total population. And this, of course, goes back to how people tend to self-identify for purposes of self-preservation and protection and so on. So indigenous organizations in Ecuador are divided into 3 tiers: national, regional, and local. The top tier is occupied by the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONAIE, that I just mentioned. The second tier comprises 3 regional confederations under CONFINIAE, the Confederación de Nacionalidades Indígenas de la Amazonia Ecuatoriana, and it represents the indigenous people of the Ecuadorian Amazon. Now, the majority of indigenous people live in this region that we refer to as Oriente Pastaza province. So the Oriente is also known as the Región Amazónica, and it's in eastern Ecuador. And it's in 1978, a burgeoning cadre of young leaders in Pastaza province founded OPIP, the local level federation of Pastaza, which is probably the most important local level indigenous organization in Ecuador. So I'm going to be I'm going to take 2 moments from Ecuadorian history. One is that of the 1992 March of Lowland Indians, and a book that I'm relying on greatly, even though I'm taking from different sources, is Susanna Sawyer's brilliant book, Crude Chronicles on Indigenous Politics, Multinational Oil, and Neoliberalism in Ecuador. So in April 1992, over 20,000 Quichua, Achuar, and Chivir Indians marched from Pastaza province in the central Ecuadorian Amazon to Quito, the capital, about 250 kilometers away. And they had two main demands at this time: land adjudication and constitutional reform. So in the Ecuadorian context, what would this mean? Land adjudication would mean the communal titling of 2 million hectares of contiguous rainforest territory in Pastaza province, forming approximately 70% of that province. And this is a picture of them marching. And even though I'm going to say this again in a moment, it was very significant because so many different people joined their ranks. And different indigenous groups as they went from their Amazonian region to the Andean region, but also people who were representing non-neoliberal interests from all walks of society. Their second demand was for a plurinational Ecuador. So it pressed for constitutional reform that would declare Ecuador a plurinational state. And the indigenous leaders underlined the fact that Ecuador was a nation composed of multiple discrete, though interconnected peoples, and that it should be recognized as such. And as I said, during the 1992 march, numerous people joined the movement, and it was construed and perceived of as a national and international spectacle from the very beginning. It drew momentum from the Pan-American Indian Campaign to mark 1992 as the culmination of 500 years of resistance in direct protest, right, of it being celebrated as the anniversary of this so-called discovery of the New World. And in this way, the march was successful in reviving alliances between the indigenous peoples from the Ecuadorian lowlands and the highlands, which is not always an easy feat. So, but then support came from all over, from the press, the police, the Red Cross, and highly surprisingly, from the dominant Blanco Mestizo enclaves. And even the president at the time, Rodrigo Borja Ceballos, vowed to receive and protect the marchers. The same president had previously denied lowland Indians their request for legal rights to their ancestral lands. The protesters also claimed the indigenous hero Humandi as a part of their demonstration. As an estimated 5,000 Indians marched into Quito, they met at the foot of the statue of the Amazonian hero Humandi at Plaza San Blas. And that's where they addressed the crowd by framing themselves as continuing the 500-year struggle for Indian dignity and political autonomy. Sorry, I'm using the word Indian because they use it, right? And in Brazil also it is used. The indigenous movement often uses the terms India and Indígena, just alternatively. So this is basically the National Palace in Quito. So this is a very famous mosaic by Osvaldo Guayasamín, the very famous Ecuadorian painter and sculptor. And what it says translates as the origin of our destiny, the epic of Francisco Orellana. And then it says the sacrifice of 3,000 aboriginals glorifies the presence of Ecuador in the Amazon River. The route is marked by their blood in our spirit. So it's basically, thank you for dying and getting out of the way. Thanks to you, we were able to build this nation. And dying was your main contribution, and we really don't expect much else from you. And it pretty much summarizes the Ecuadorian attitude towards indigenous peoples. So the mosaic clearly equates Orellana with our and us, the Ecuadorians. So the imagined Ecuadorian community here only includes those of common European descent. The indigenous people, on the other hand, are banished to the fringes via both decree and omission. Right? The mosaic and the epigraph are also an epitaph, basically marking their tombs. And so in Brazil, this is also going to be very much the case. So indigenous peoples are basically seen as crucial to the unfolding of an imperial and national drama, but simultaneously they're just anachronic elements, remnants of the past, and not relevant at all to Ecuador's present and future. And because of this, they're also perceived as a constant obstacle in the face of elite white reason and progress. So also, the Ecuadorian constitution even states that Ecuador was, is, and shall be an Amazonian country with 1% of the rainforest, right? And the Ecuadorian map further reveals the state's obsession with the Amazon. Ecuadorian history, both official and popular, strategically ignores earlier border treaties with Peru and insists that the nation's true historical heritage is a sovereign right to the Amazon. So you have quite a bit of, quite a lot of delusion going on there with regards to the Amazon. So, not surprisingly, the symbolic value of the Amazon is conflated with the state's historically crucial economic value that it places, that is placed on the region, on the state. And in the mid-1960s, the Upper Amazon became incorporated into larger state designs to transform the region into the country's new breadbasket as this new fountain of black gold, basically. And, this happened mainly with oil being discovered in the northern Amazon in the 1960s. Thereupon, Ecuador joined OPEC in 1973. And the colonization of this region of the Oriente became a heightened state preoccupation, and petroleum became a national security concern. So normally, I have to try hard to kind of like make things more relatable to my students, but teaching in Laredo, Texas, talking about this is really not that hard because Texaco, the longest producing oil company in Ecuador, continues to exploit sizable oil reserves after 25 years. And Texaco has historically used deteriorating and outmoded equipment, which has contaminated sizable segments of the surface and subterranean water and oil systems in Oriente. So beginning in the 1950s and intensifying with the 1964 Agrarian Reform Law, homesteaders also colonized a large area in Pastaza. And OPIP leaders and community members believed that along with further colonization, the devastating effects of oil in the north would soon threaten their territory, very justifiably so. And self-organization represented the most secure vehicle through which indigenous peoples might have a voice in shaping or at least influencing to some extent their future. And so with this background, more specifically, the 1992 march resulted from 3 years of frustrating negotiations with the state and the subsequent disavowal of the Sarajevo Accord. So basically, there was this accord that was signed in Sarajevo, and the state later on, and this is an actual picture of the discussions surrounding the accord. But 8 months later, the Borja government just said that this accord had taken place under force and that therefore it was not valid. And consequently, disputes over land rights heightened, and Indians occupied the Santo Domingo Cathedral in Quito and embarked on a hunger strike And these events inspired the first CONAIE-led indigenous mobilizations to obstruct the workings of the Ecuadorian state and the national economy. And through their leadership, Indian communities forced the government to enter into negotiations over land disputes. As part of these CONAIE state negotiations, OPIP presented the government with a bold proposal called the Acuerdo Territorial. The Acuerdo contained two themes that challenge conventional understandings. So the ones that we basically mentioned at the beginning, plurinationality and self-determination. The proposal called for the communal titling of ancestral lands and political, cultural, and economic control over them. This is a picture of protests taking place then. So the Acuerdo is actually very interesting as a document, as a historical document in itself. It was written in a very unconventional style, mixing social memory, mythology, and metaphor. So it really appealed to indigenous understandings of the land and not the state's understandings. And it was deemed subversive and unconstitutional exactly because of this. So in both official and unofficial commentary, such indigenous activities were seen as a threat to state sovereignty, and the ideas that Indians are lazy and undeserving of so much land was constantly echoed in the discourses of landowners. So the Botha administration only partially conceded to indigenous demands, granting Indians only 55% of the ancestral territory. Moreover, they did much worse. They divided indigenous lands into 19 land blocks, which in no way corresponded to indigenous understandings of their groupings and land. So with regards to their own perceived identities, in addition to identifying themselves through their nationality or pueblo, as it refers to ethnic affiliation, stating their nation or pueblo was actually a way for indigenous people to locate themselves within a place, within a locality filled with territory and history, identity and directive, an understanding of power and exclusion. The Botha regime also established a 40-kilometer wide security zone paralleling the Peruvian border. So we have two things at stake here, of course, the policing of both foreign and internal borders, but also what they did was to designate this entire area as an empty white blank space and denying the fact that thousands of indigenous people are actually living there. And they also used the territory of Yasuni National Park to do the same thing. I'm not gonna go into that, but again, whenever you think of the Amazon, people are living everywhere. But the way in which both state and environmental discourses across Latin America posit them is as if it was just the environment. And it's just full of trees and rivers, and there are no people who actually use that land sustainably and have been doing so for centuries. So Yasuni National Park is also seen as a blank white space devoid of humans, when in fact thousands of people are living there. So very soon we saw concerns for the environment playing an increasingly prominent role in shaping activity in Pastaza. And by the 1990s, the indigenous lands had somehow become the rainforest, right? Vocabulary and rhetoric that had never previously been used, that was all of a sudden being taken advantage of on all sides. So this resulted on the parts of indigenous peoples in eco-speak, and for the 1992 marchers themselves, environmental concerns were certainly an important part of what they were doing. And they were very well aware that stating themselves to be the defenders of the rainforest was going to get them greater levels of international attention and acknowledgement. But of course, their understanding of the environment and environmental protection was different. So indigenous people across Latin America usually react very strongly against extremists of tropical conservation, maintaining that an integral component of indigenous identity is the sustainable use of the tropical forest, which has been going on for millennia. Similarly, indigenous people across the Amazon recognize that their historical connection to this landscape has been strongly shaped by a history of conquest, colonization, and exploitation. And this historical inequality continues to inform Indians' sense of self and their resolve to achieve at least some degree of self-determination, while it also constitutes one of the main platforms through which they have succeeded in garnering crucial international support. So this has resulted in a successful construction of Amazonia, of the rainforest, as the last environmental Eden on Earth, and basically indigenous peoples as protectors of it. But of course, indigenous peoples are not the only people who use ecospeak, right? So this also allows state and corporate experts to do the same and to engage in activities of mapping, such as those that I just mentioned, and using environmental concerns actually to support their own goals. And oil organizations and companies have also become stakeholders of ecospeak. So, for instance, by establishing the environmental committee, ARCOSO, to gather together what they called the stakeholders to discuss their common concern. So you see a certain discourse being successfully used by indigenous peoples and then reclaimed by all sides and turned around, which is of course something that we are very used to seeing in many different contexts. And simultaneously, this has resulted in the denial of indigenous understandings of the environment in a broad sense, because these understandings are as social as they are geotechnical. And all of a sudden, when you take away their political underpinnings and this whole history of conquest and colonialism that are such a major part of these discussions, then environmental consciousness just becomes emptied out of any indigenous understanding of the environment. And also, legal land titles don't always do that much, because often the state continues to have control over subterranean resources, and title deeds just basically refer to what's above the land. Even so, of course, not more homesteaders coming in and colonizing indigenous territory is an important thing in itself. So what happened in 92 was highly incomplete and compromised. And the state later sought to intensify exploration in the province by enacting neoliberal policy reform and promoting new corporate alliances. And I'm going to go over very quickly. I was going to talk about this 2021-2023 moment. And basically, when Guillermo Lasso came into office, he just implemented one neoliberal reform after the other. And it's just like a market for the commercialization of hydrocarbons, regulations to create a market for the distribution of electricity, no financial relief to any sectors. It was just full-on neoliberal reform. And even though there was reaction, he just kept going further and further with privatization, deregulation, the opening of the economy, and labor flexibility. and really, really horrible labor reforms, especially. Workers were dismissed without notice, he reintroduced child and adolescent labor, just a complete nightmare. What was perhaps most important, though, is that his political reforms were processed independently and on a different track from the political system and political debate, which meant that not much could be done against them directly to counter them. And the indigenous movement had changed during this time. Pachakutik, which was basically it's the political organ of the indigenous movement. It's formed in 1985. And at this time, because they did not want to ally themselves with the previous Borja administration, they came to support these neoliberal reforms and this government. And on the other hand, there was Konaye, which was just the movement side, and Pachakutik came to odds. And at the end of 2021, when the government came with a whole new set of neoliberal reforms, among these, a new regulatory framework for oil contracts caused a lot of concern to indigenous people. And I'm not gonna continue with Lasso's neoliberal policies, but so in face of all this, Konaye started making its demands, but they also realized that they did not have the support of their own people within Pachakutik. And President Lasso felt like he didn't need to give in to indigenous demands at all because he had Pachakutik support. So Leonidas Isa Salazar emerged as the new leadership of Konaye during this period, and under him, the movement took on a much more radical tone. He traveled throughout the country and talked to different regional and local indigenous organizations. He quickly realized that he was not going to have the support of Pachakutik. So he decided that the indigenous movement could not be circumscribed within the narrow confines of the political system. So he started this whole organizing work, held assemblies in all regions, and Konaye decided to go on a national mobilization on June 13, 2022, with 10 points ranging from the freezing of fuel prices to a moratorium on the extractor frontier. So actually, the policies that he came up with were not very different from the strategy that was used by the indigenous movement during the 1992 mobilization. And the idea was that if the mobilization could be sustained in the territories, then it could last a long time and the government would sooner or later give in. And at the same time, the government was using Pachakutik to divide the indigenous movement. And so there was a major mobilization, and Leonidas Isa was arrested. And in the absence of legal backing, and given the position of the State Attorney General's office to refrain from accusing him, his arrest became a kidnapping, which under Ecuadorian law is a state crime, which can directly lead to the impeachment of the president. And as soon as the news of the arrest were known, the indigenous communities decided to radicalize their positions. And what was only originally a territorial and indefinite mobilization became a major indigenous uprising. And community members and leaders of the Konaye branches decided to move on to a new stage of struggle through capturing Quito to free their leader. And in a few hours, the meaning and strategy of the mobilization had fully changed. It had become a major national issue. And the growing outrage motivated other social sectors to claim the freedom of the indigenous leader, and he was actually released after 24 hours of illegal detention. And it was in many ways a very successful mobilization on the part of the indigenous movement in Ecuador, especially at a time where they did not have, they did not present a united front. So I do want to briefly at least talk about Brazil. Brazil is different from Ecuador in the sense that there are 305 indigenous groups living in Brazil today, totaling around 1.7 million people. And the government has recognized 690 territories for its indigenous population, which cover about 13% of Brazil's landmass. Nearly all of this reserve land lies in the Amazon. So similar to CONAIE in Ecuador, what we have in Brazil is FUNAI, the Fundação Nacional dos Povos Indígenas, which is a Brazilian governmental protection agency for indigenous Brazilian interests. But it is a very complicated agency. It was created as part of a certain law which officially placed Indians under the protection of FUNAI through the Indian statute. And the Indian statute had the very controversial goal of integrating Indians into society as soon as possible so that they could become economically productive Brazilian, I want to say citizens, but they never really are, rather subjects. So while protection from a government agency is of course important for indigenous populations, this has also historically meant that FUNAI, as a part of the government, has had authority to act contrary to the welfare of the indigenous peoples. And you can never know if you can trust FUNAI or not. Now, I'm going to skip a major part here about Cacique Raoni and the first incidents of isolation encounter. And I will just talk about demarcação a tiny bit because that will help me make a further point later about the marco temporal. So in 1989, when the rainforest was kind of coming into everybody's radar, Cacique Raoni visited 17 countries with Sting, and he had a very successful campaign to raise awareness around the world about the deforestation of the rainforest. And 12 rainforest foundations were created, and in 1993, funds raised worldwide helped to make Raoni's dream a reality, which was to bring the Xingu indigenous lands together, creating one of the world's most important rainforest reserves, but also the world's most important indigenous territory. So when established in 1988, Article 231 of the Brazilian Constitution also marked a watershed moment in the country's indigenous history. And it read, "It is recognized that the indigenous peoples have the right to their social organization, customs, languages, beliefs, and traditions, and their original rights over the lands that they have traditionally occupied. It being the duty of the federal government to demarcate these lands, protect them, and ensure that all their properties and assets are respected." For years, those who have wanted to profit off of the land and riches of the Amazon region have been trying to use a loophole in this law that is known as the marco temporal. So it says demarcação já, this picture already, let's have the demarcation. Nossa segurança, nosso território, our land is our safety. And so the marco temporal means that, and it was very highly supported by Bolsonaro's, I'm not going to use any adjectives, government, which argued that indigenous people only had the rights to their territories if they were able to prove that they occupied them at the time of Brazil's 1988 constitution. How is that going to be possible in a context where many indigenous groups were pushed out or had to leave their territories when the country was colonized and were, not the country, their land was colonized. And just because of this law, they were actually recently able to return to their original lands. So there was a victory in September this year when the Brazilian Supreme Court finally voted against the Marco Temporal. And even though it's a major win, ever since then, there have been a million other efforts on the part of neoliberal interests and stakeholders, economic stakeholders in the Amazon to undo it. So I'm going to talk about very quickly two other important moments within the indigenous history of Brazil. A very major one refers to the Belo Monte Dam, formerly known as Cararau, and there is a video I would like to listen to a tiny bit of later, and you will hear this word there. It's a hydroelectric dam complex on the northern part of the Xingu River in Pará State. And it was a major dam project, and it has been realized. So as of now, it's the second largest dam complex in Brazil and the fifth largest in the world by installed capacity. It's in the spat middle of the Amazon. So the 2000 plan, which included Belo Monte, among the 297 dams that were to be constructed in Brazil, was leaked early, and it very quickly caused indigenous reaction and mobilization. And the government offered little transparency to the people who would be directly affected by this project, which provoked indigenous peoples of the region to organize what they call the Primeiro Encontro das Nações Indígenas do Xingu, also known as the Altamira gathering in 1989. It did have results. So the 5 dams above Belo Monte were removed from the planning, and then at the insistence of the Cararau people, the name of the dam was changed from Cararau to Belo Monte. And I mean, the environmental damage that was projected then to be caused and was actually caused is insane. And loss of vegetation and natural spaces, changes in fauna and flora, changes in water, fish migration routes, you name it. And, huge emissions of carbon dioxide, equivalent would be generated during construction and later on. I mean, it's been a nightmare ever since it opened. But of course, the Xingu Indigenous Park is where the dam is. And this national park was first created in 1961 in Mato Grosso. And its official purposes were to protect the environment and the numerous indigenous peoples in the area. And the people living within the boundaries of the park are numerous. I have only been to the Kwikuro and the Yavalapiti villages. The Kwikuro one is as you enter. You have to be invited. And I've been several times to stay in several of these villages. Especially, I've been part of this yearly festival, which is called Kwarup. And basically, it's in one of the villages of the Xingu every summer. Well, summer for us, winter for them. And basically, all the peoples of the Xingu gather there. And there are a lot of discussions, policy making, but also a lot of celebration. So these are pictures that I took there. I also have pictures of myself there. I didn't think that would be a good idea to show. So in 2014, a ruling Workers' Party senator testified that grant money skimmed from overpriced contracts to build Belo Monte was used by Dilma Rousseff's election campaigns. And this resulted, and more and more actual news regarding the millions paid in bribes in exchange for contracts to build the dam right on the Shingo River came to the surface. A nationwide mobilization ensued, but was not sufficient to stop the construction of the dam. At this time, a lot of people, including me, we changed all our Facebook last names to Guarani Kaiowá because they were the two most important indigenous groups in Mato Grosso do Sul. As Kasike Raoni, protesting against Dilma. So what's going on today? Not great things. Brazil's current president, Lula, who is also not doing a great job, has never done a great job regarding indigenous peoples, but obviously he's not Bolsonaro, has accused his predecessor of committing genocide against the indigenous Yanomami people of the Amazon by enabling thousands of gold miners in a nationally protected territory to settle in a region where mining is actually banned. And illegal mining flourished during Bolsonaro's tenure, and a humanitarian crisis emerged in the Yanomami territory. The illegal miners, garimpeiros, have been accused of poisoning rivers with mercury, wrecking forests, both of which the Yanomami, of course, depend greatly on for their survival, and also of death threats and sexual violence against Yanomami women, especially. And Brazil's Minister of Justice and Public Security, Flávio Dino, has recently stated that federal police would investigate the possibility of genocide among the Yanomami. And so close to 30,000 Yanomami people live in Brazil's indigenous territory, that spans Brazil and Venezuela, so right on the border. They are also the people who possess the largest indigenous territory in Brazil, occupying 9.4 million hectares in the northern Amazon. So this is actually an indigenous person looking at illegal miners in Yanomami territory. So Cacique Raoni and the person I'm going to talk about in just a moment, Davi Kopenava Yanomami. If you haven't read The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman, everybody should. It is an amazing book. And Davi Kopenava is a shaman and Portuguese speaking spokesperson for the Yanomami. He has been very important in the Brazilian indigenous movement. And he has been highly vocal about the catastrophic impact on Yanomami health as a consequence of the illegal invasion of their land by 40,000 illegal miners. Another very important person to the indigenous movement, who is not as famous as Davi Kopenava, but you can find translations of his books into English even on Amazon. So he was born in 1954 in Minas Gerais and is a writer, journalist, philosopher, and indigenous leader of Krenak ethnicity, who was forcibly separated from his people, who had 5,000 members at the beginning of the 20th century. And right now, there's only 130 individuals are left from this entire group, and he was separated from them at age 9. He has functioned as a representative of indigenous peoples at the debates on the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, and he has co-founded and participated in several indigenous rights organizations and received numerous awards. And he's also an exceptionally good writer that I definitely recommend reading. And I'm going to end on a note of intersectionality, especially with regards to the sexual violence against Indigenous women. We are thinking that there have been more than 5,000 cases of rape as part of the genocide against the Yanomami, as well as numerous other incidents of sexual violence, also murders. And I'm going to give you one horrible example, which we should not forget. And this was in 2016 when an Indigenous toddler was murdered in cold blood, and Brazil barely took notice. So what happened was that in the afternoon of December 30, 2016, a Kaingang mother was in Imbituba, a state of Santa Catarina, so very much southern Brazil, very, very white Brazil, mostly German immigration, right? And so a lot of people will come to sell their indigenous products and like artisanal products and everything. So she's there and with her products, and she's breastfeeding her 2-year-old son while sitting on the sidewalk. And they had been sleeping there for several days. And the young mother was holding her baby. There was a video of this for a while online. I don't think it's there now. I actually made the mistake of seeing it, and I cried for like a week nonstop. And so the young mother is holding her baby while resting her back against the wall. And a guy just comes by, and originally he's acting all normal. He first touches the baby's face and then he just cuts the baby's throat with a blade. And and it's all recorded, right? As he runs away, the mother is yelling for help, but the 2-year-old toddler is soon dead. And this brazen murder of an innocent child, killed literally in his mother's arms in broad daylight, didn't even make headlines in Brazil. A few media bothered to report what happened. I have translated a few of some progressive journalists and one historian who cares about the indigenous cause greatly have said. And I think they're significant in bringing all this back to the colonial history of Brazil. So Eliane Brum, who is a journalist, a white Brazilian woman, said that if it had been my son or any other white middle-class woman's child murdered under those circumstances, there would be headlines, there would be specialists analyzing violence, skipping some, but we thought it was indigenous, a baby but indigenous, small but indigenous, a victim but indigenous, murdered but indigenous. The historian Valdir Rampinelli said that ever since Latin America became a European business, indigenous lives have always been the cheapest ones on the continent. That's not news. Racism against indigenous people is historical. As soon as Brazil became independent, nothing changed for indigenous peoples. The journalist and educator Elaine Tavares said when Spanish and Portuguese explorers arrived in Latin America, indigenous people were branded non-humans, second-class citizens, unfaithful, useless. Through all these centuries, a negative image of indigenous peoples has been built, only to justify the invasion, the robbery of their lands and riches. Indigenous peoples are seen as something standing in the way, just like in the Ecuadorian case at the National Assembly, an uncomfortable remembrance of the massacre. That is why the best solution ends up being to confine them in some reserve, away from people's eyes. But if they decide to go out and share the white world's life, then the thing becomes ugly. So the struggle is real, but that's not the note I want to end on. I want to end rather on this note, which is again photographed by Edgar Canaco Chacriabá. That is the Planalto Central, that is the actual Brazilian presidential palace. And you have indigenous peoples pointing their arrows. towards it. This is a photo that I love. And also considering that the Planalto Central is basically used to be indigenous land. And, Brasilia was, we think of it as, oh, it was created in the middle of the country where nothing existed. Of course, it was created on indigenous land where actually a lot existed and a lot of people existed. And on this note, o futuro é indígena. The future is indigenous. Thank you.
Okay, I know we got a bit of a late start, but does anybody have questions or comments?
So I was just thinking, because my dad actually was asking me about like what's been happening in Ecuador recently, and sort of the growing violence as I understand it there. And I wonder how, because I feel like what you said sort of stopped in like 2021, 22, but like what is happening for indigenous people in Ecuador like right now?
I was also thinking about that, but usually you can't really know until a bit later.
Sure.
And that hasn't been the focus. But the current president, Lasso got impeached twice, and then finally, right, there was a government change. He is miraculously almost like a real centrist. He does have like some conservative policies with regards to some things, but with regards to inclusion, he seems to be doing a lot better so far than his predecessors and even his predecessors from the left. So, but it remains to be seen. Also, he's just been kind of, he's been on full on like crisis mode ever since he became president. So he hasn't really engaged in a lot of like new policy making. And so we haven't seen what he's going to do and what kinds of reactions that's going to create. We don't know how he's going to approach oil, for example. And so it's a little too early to say something about it. But for now, I'm cautiously, slightly optimistic.
That's a good position to be in, hopefully. Hopefully you're right.
There's a lot there that I would love to kind of dig into, but again, I'm never one to kind of go with the Americocentric or the US-centric way of looking at the world, but looking at what indigenous in Ecuador and indigenous in Brazil have been able to do. What lessons could indigenous peoples and organizations here in the United States learn from them? Because, the thought of indigenous people in the United States marching on Washington, potentially, it's like pointing bows, if not arrows, at the White House or Congress is just so, I'm going to say almost inconceivable. And yet you're showing us images of this happening down there. I mean, so what lessons could we learn? Because again, we always seem to think the United States, we're the best country in the world, we know everything. Well, there's a lot that we can learn from other parts of the world. And I'm thinking in this instance, given your travels and your knowledge of these communities, what can we learn from them? Particularly, when I think of, the fights out in North Dakota and other, it's like against the various pipelines and the oil, which is very much, in the center of things in your presentation. What can we learn?
I was also thinking about this, but more like kind of in the negative sense, like what's making this stuff difficult to happen in the US kind of sense. And I don't know how much it has to do with the American political system that basically hinders, kind of organization and mobilization beyond the state level. in many ways. Because if you were to think of, Native American communities in the US, and like so many Brazilian communities are much smaller than them, right? But they have been successful in coming together around a common cause and mobilizing. So, of course, the specific context of the Amazon in representing a huge environmental urgency that affects all of us makes worldwide support to the indigenous cause somewhat easier to access than it would be in the US. And also, there's this understanding that international interests can interfere in Latin America, right? And so it works in, interference from the outside into national sovereignties, yes, but it also can be reverted to work for different groups of peoples and like being able to mobilize international support for their causes in a way that would be impossible with the US, right? Because the US just wouldn't let it happen. I do think that there are many more internal factors with regards to how indigenous communities are construed, how much relocation. I mean, of course, the Xingu is also an artificial space in many ways. There are people who were originally there. There are people who were moved there. There are people. There's always encroachment. There's always enclosure. Maybe not to the same extent as what took place in the US though. And I don't think Latin America's history of colonization, it's hard to ever say it was bloodier or less bloody or more, but I do think it was different in certain fundamental ways that do reflect themselves in how current indigenous politics unfolds as well. There definitely could be some lessons, but any kind of mobilization that is to come out of the US setting is gonna have to be built upon specific US indigenous realities and American US processes of colonization. And I do think there are ways in which they're fundamentally different, but that's another very long
Yes.
discussion.
Thank you. Other thoughts or questions? Not really.
Sorry, I skipped over a whole chunk, but even so, I went over time.
Okay, well, again, we started late, so thank you very much, Dr. Berktay. This has been wonderful, and yes, let's continue on with lunch, and we will have this up on our website, so thank you.